begin by thanking the Department of History, Professor Rajiv Handik, for inviting me. I'm honored that Professor Udayan Mishra is chairing the session. I'm also humbled by the presence of a large number of friends here, Professor Saikia, Professor Bora, Professor uh, Indrani, and so many others, and my very, very good friends Kuldeep and Uttam. Uh, it's a pleasure to come to Guwahati once again and breathe a cleaner and freer air. I come from the most polluted city probably in the world, but certainly India, and not only environmentally polluted, but politically also perhaps the most polluted city at the moment. It's it's really the moment you get off the airport, the aircraft, you feel the freedom. And from the speech that you just now heard, the way everybody has spoken already, the way Professor Mishra spoke, it's becoming unfortunately very rare in this country, that you talk of resistance. you know, is the very talk of resistance is becoming very rare. Uh, I had come here earlier to give the third Amalindu Guha Memorial Lecture many years ago in 2018, and I'm really very honored to be a speaker at the birth centenary commemoration of Professor Guha. In fact, I cut my teeth at historical research under Professor Guha's guidance. The very first research piece that I wrote, unfortunately 50 years ago, I'm very old, uh, was on the agrarian structure of the 5 districts of the Brahmaputra Valley in the 19th century. And predictably, the paper went to Professor Guha for peer review. And he was appreciative, made very meaningful comments. And I mean, as I said, that was my first interaction with him. As has been said, and I will not repeat, Professor Guha's work was not limited to economic history. It traversed peasant rebellions, working class initiatives, class conflict in rural and urban settings, impact of migration, the larger national struggle, the freedom movement, etc. In brief, basic political economy is what Professor Guha engaged in. That was his forte. And as was said, he taught for a long period in a college in Darang and acquired a position in the world of academia, not out of careerism, but by simply by the quality of the output of his research. His generation of scholars brought issues of political economy which determine the lives of common people to the fore. When as was mentioned earlier, when bland political, constitutional, and dynastic histories was the common thing taught. In fact, people of my generation benefited from people like Amalindu Guha, who forefronted scientific, anti-colonial, anti-communal, progressive, pro-people historiography. It is they who taught us to ask the question why and how, rather than repeat the issues of who, what, and when. That is what gets often taught in history, and that is one reason why so many young people run away from the discipline. Unfortunately, in recent decades, particularly after the neoliberal turn from about the 80s onwards, this kind of historiography, which forefronts political economy, has been hijacked by what I would call a motley stream of postmodernism, so-called post-colonial culture studies, subaltern studies, and what have you, unfortunately, all emanating from the first world, not from Darang. As Arif Darlik puts it, this motley stream emerges when the third world intellectual arrives in the first world. It is they who are promoting this historiography. For example, the Subaltern Studies School claims to give voice to the poor, to the marginalized, with one condition, that you give voice from 10,000 miles away, from Chicago, from John Hopkins, from Australia, from Sussex, where have you. And the latest conference of Subaltern School was held just about a month ago. Guess where? In the most expensive hotel in Delhi, the Oberoi's, where the poor like me would not be even allowed to enter if I don't wear a tie. So, so much for historiography. It is a tribute to the memory of Professor Guha that, and all that he stood for, that I have chosen the subject of political economy and of colonial and post-colonial India. This happens to be, as was said, also the title of my latest book. I will take some issues from that book and focus on what I consider the chief contradiction in Indian society today, which is not economic but political, on the hope and with the belief that that is what Professor Guha would have wanted, focusing on what is currently the most important issue rather than what personally would have interested him as a research scholar. This discussion we are going to have is a contemporary history discussion. I know contemporary history sounds like an oxymoron, contradiction in terms. How is it, how is it both history and contemporary? But just a minute on the subject, since I believe that I am a contemporary historian, I must explain what contemporary history is. It is not period defined. There is no date on which you can say modern history has ended and contemporary history has started. It's a method. It's how you approach the subject of history. And that is that you ask contemporary questions. You look at contemporary society, ask questions, and go back as much as necessary to answer that question. I'll give you 2 or 3 illustrations. I mean, what is the obvious thing that hits you when you look at India? Why is India poor today? The answer cannot be that our Prime Minister does not know economics, which of course he does not. He knows entire political science, he doesn't know economics. But the answer is that when was India not poor? If you look at the statistics of the early 18th century, 1700, India produced nearly a quarter of the world's GDP and 8 times the GDP of the United Kingdom. So obviously India was not poor at that time. So we need to know what happened since then. So you will at least go back to the early 18th century to answer the question, why is India poor today? All right. Similarly, why is India a democracy? However much the assault on it that is happening today, has it still survived as a democracy, despite when, in fact, probably one among the very few, if not the only post-colonial country which has had a prolonged stint as a democracy? Again, the answer to that will take us at least to the middle of the 19th century, when the future Indian nation was being imagined. And in that imagination, democracy was a central idea. As early as 1890s, Tilak is talking of adult franchise, when the concept was decades away in the world. So this was a central idea. But others, people like Jawaharlal Nehru in his Discovery of India, which is a must reread. I must say that particularly to the younger people here. Begin your study of Indian history with Nehru's Discovery of India. I reread it as often as I can, and I learn every time I learn something from it. And borrowing from that, what conceptually Nehru writes there, Amartya Sen have both gone back to explain our current democracy to our civilizational history in the ancient and medieval past. From the Indus Valley civilization to the Rig Veda, to the Upanishads, to Buddha, to Akbar, to Kabir, to Guru Nanak, Nehru traverses this field to project the fact that there was a dialogical tradition in this country, which is the heart of democracy. There was a tradition of living with difference, the tradition of multiple truths. Buddha talked about 1,000 truths, and so they say that these were important elements from which the Indian national movement drew to argue that we should be a democracy. So, as I said, the answer can take you back to ancient India. In fact, what Amartya Sen does in one of his books, Argumentative Indian, and even more in the book called Idea of Justice, which is also a must read, where he says that if you look at the ancient manuscripts in Sanskrit and compare it with Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, and other ancient languages, you find far more questioning. Somebody saying there is God, and the other fellow saying that there isn't any God, or somebody saying God is in this form, the other person saying he's not in that form, etc., than in any other thing. And this tradition is something that we draw from. Thirdly, third example I want to give is, why has religious identity and communal politics emerged as a major threat in India? Despite our being one of the first, such a pulsating democracy for so many decades, why has it emerged as the major force? Again, the answer must take us back to a situation where Indian society was not divided fundamentally in its economy, polity, culture on the basis of religion. It is an assumption that religious divide was there from the time that various religions came in, but it is not a fact. I mean, if you go back even as recent as the 1857 rebellion, who did the soldiers who rebelled, who were from all kinds of religion and caste, a lot of them Brahmins, who did they go rushing to and say that you please take over? They went to the Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar. They did not ask the question that he is a Muslim. The notion that Indian society was divided on the basis of religion emerges from Britain. James Mill, Hindu rule, Muslim rule. It did not exist. There was no such thing as Hindu rule and Muslim rule. Right? And it is the British who begin the demonization of the Muslims in India in the beginning, especially after the mutiny. And it is this which was borrowed, this conception which was borrowed by the Hindu communalists. I don't have time to elaborate on that, but I've written extensively a full chapter on this, the link between colonialism and communalism. You must remind yourselves repeatedly of that, because the communalist claims to be, he masquerades as the nationalist. The very people who were the instruments of imperialism to subvert Indian nationalism are now parading as nationalists. So that this link must be demonstrated. Okay. As you can see, historians must have a very long introduction before they get to the subject. But I think the introduction is important, because there's no point in just getting to the facts without the perspective in which we are getting into the facts. This discussion, as you will see also, or contemporary history, in fact, history itself, must by definition be multidisciplinary. You cannot just look at one aspect of society. Economics, politics, culture, literature, environment, climate, all of it, genetics, all of it is critical to a good history writing. The more disciplines you can incorporate, the better history you write. And that is why the philosopher, historian E.P. Thompson described history as the master discipline, the queen of humanities. And I say that to history students who are often made to believe that कहीं और एडमिशन नहीं मिला था, चलो हिस्ट्री कर लेते हैं. It is not this. It is the master discipline, because it is this discipline which incorporates every other discipline. Unlike the economist, which is the discipline I studied, where you make assumptions. You say, assuming that there is no political disturbance, assuming there is no climate change, assuming this, you make 20 assumptions, and then you say, if you increase one factor of production, let's say capital, what would be the impact on labor? Now, historian cannot assume anything. He has to deal with this huge range of possibilities, and that is why it is the master discipline. Finally, the study of transitions has acquired salience in the recent historiography. The period of transition is a very important period to study. Transition from ancient to modern, modern to medieval, medieval to modern, from feudalism to capitalism. These are all now being studied. From capitalism to socialism, and now the reverse, the shift back from socialism into capitalism. Two of the biggest socialist economies are pushing capitalism in a manner which puts you to shame. So these are questions that need to be raised. The shift from empires to nation states, this transition is an extremely important one. And the shift from nation states into its disintegration, a path towards which we are moving now, is also a very important phenomenon. It's a transition. The transition that happened in Pakistan, the transition that happened in Yugoslavia. Why do nation states emerge and why do they break up? Are issues that we need to look at. My book is divided into 4 parts. I'll talk about the first 3 parts in very brief and then expand on one aspect, which is the communal situation in the end. The first part of the book deals with the colonial situation. There are about 5 chapters in it. Don't worry, I'm not going to summarize them. Except just make a few points which I find, as having been a teacher for a long time, which need to be made. One of them is that colonialism should not be frozen into one frame. What we are taught in class 5 and which we keep repeating till we give our entrance examination to JNU for MPhil, which is colonialism is export of raw material and import of manufactured goods. Saying this in 200 ways is not colonialism. This is just one form, not necessarily even the dominant form. If you freeze colonialism only in this frame, then you do not see it when it comes in other frames, and right over in front of your eyes, you don't see it as colonial. I'll give you an example. Colonialism actually, in very brief, is the transfer of whatever happens to be the most important or critical factor of production at a point of historical time. Before the world witnessed industrialization, what was the critical factor of production? Obviously land. But land is of no use if you don't have labor, right? So what was colonialism in the 15th and 16th centuries or the 17th century? Grabbing other people's land and calling it discovery. Entire continents, were grabbed. And then the people of that continent were committed to labor in that land in a manner that they died. 95% of the Mexican indigenous population died. But then you still need to work those mines and the fields. So you get labor from Africa. So that is what colonialism was. There is no export of raw material, import of manufactured goods happening. In the stage of once industrialization process begins, the critical factor of production is capital. So colonialism then consisted of transfer of capital from the colonies into the metropolitan countries. What form that capital would take could vary. It could be raw material, it could be food, it could be tea, it could be coffee, it could be rubber, it could be tin, it could be oil, and it could be manufactured goods. For the first 50 years of British colonialism in India, India exported manufactured goods. And the most important manufactured good at that time, from the mid-18th to the end of the 18th century, was textile, and India was the largest exporter of textiles in the world. But it was still colonized. That's why I said that you do not look at colonialism in one frame. What is the most critical factor of production today? Knowledge. And what are we doing? What is the third world doing? En masse, the best of your knowledge is migrating or is encouraged to migrate. Your Prime Minister will go and argue कि इनको green card क्यों नहीं देते हो? All right. And while you push that migration, you pat yourself in the back, saying that, wow. In the 1960s, the United States had only 14% of people who did research in critical breakthrough areas of science and technology who were non-American. Today it is more than 40%. More than 1 out of 5 are people who are coming from India, China, etc. So we are pushing it out, they are raking it in, and while pushing it out, we are patting ourselves in the back. Like one IIT professor, I do not mean to be rude to the young IIT kids at the back, but I met him at a workshop. We were getting our car serviced, and as you know, Indians don't have to be introduced to each other to start chatting. Within few minutes, you will find out the caste and the income of the other guy, and then you can place that person right. So, but he was a professor, so he didn't do all that, and we started chatting. And after a point, he says, "Professor Mukherjee, I'm delighted today." So I thought maybe one of his students has made a breakthrough, some invention, some discovery. And then he says, Professor Mukherjee, my whole class has gone to the US. So I almost fainted. What kind of teachers have we produced? That you take credit for having thrown out. As I said, pat yourself in the back for colonizing your own country, for allowing the transfer of the critical factor of production knowledge to the metropolis. You think it is a very good thing. It is because you haven't studied history. That's why IITs must have the social sciences, must not produce just engineers who go abroad and then fund Hindutva or similar such stuff. Okay. Uh, I have in this book also dealt with 2 or 3 other things in the economic part. One of them is question the notion of decolonization. It's very popular. There are many scholars, including unfortunately Indians, who have migrated or have migrated and come back, and again trying to migrate, who argue that from 1914 onwards, the process of decolonization began. Britain was beginning to pull out, and in fact was encouraging Indian industrialization. And some, like Ian Drummond and Clive Dewey, argue that after 1914, India began to exploit Britain. So leave alone British colonialism continues. So I have argued that it is actually rubbish. It emerges from, again, freezing colonialism in one frame, because in this period 1914 to 47, India witnessed a lot of import substitution. That is, we reduced our import of manufactured goods from Britain hugely. For example, textile imports virtually stopped. We began to produce our own cloth, our own sugar and stuff like that, own cement, a lot of our own steel before independence itself. So that's when these guys say this is decolonization, not realizing that what has happened in this period is a switch of imperial interest from the industrial interest to a financial interest. 14 to 47 is the worst phase in Indian history, when the level of resources that are extracted out of India reaches its peak. I mean, do remember the 3 million people died of famine, at the end of the colonial rule. So there is obviously something going which was very wrong. And I demonstrate that the shift really occurs after independence, with facts and figures, that how there is a qualitative jump in the nature of the Indian economy after independence. So there is no continuity, but in fact, it is the break which enables the growth that we witness. The neo-colonial view, which has come back into fashion, the colonial perspective was critiqued very early by Indians. Again, it's an aspect of our colonized minds that we do not know that the first comprehensive critique of economic imperialism emerged out of India. It is people like Dadabhai Naroji, R.C. Dutt, etc., decades before Marx, decades before Rosa Luxemburg, decades before Hobson, were making a comprehensive critique of economic imperialism. And the common sense of the Indian people had become, indeed, an anti-imperialist understanding of imperialism. But the colonial effort was not abandoned. It re-emerged after independence by the 1960s. There's a scholar called Maurice de Morris, which many of you would have read, began this process of saying that how colonialism was very good for India, which was then taken up by the Cambridge Economic History of India, huge fat volume, which doesn't even mention the word drain except to say there was no drain occurred, and so on and so forth. And then was taken up by yours famously, Professor Tirthankar Roy, who once taught in the Gokhale Institute, which used to be a very nationalist institution and has appropriately now ended up in the London School of Economics. He wrote this book called the Oxford Economic History of India, which he said was a summary of the Cambridge Economic History of India, in which he argues, and believe you me, I've written a whole chapter on this. My presidential address in modern India was a critique of Tirthankar Roy, where he argues that India not only witnessed growth, but witnessed rapid economic growth under colonialism. And if colonialism had not happened, India could not possibly have achieved the various milestones that it achieved. Ignoring the fact that from being an economy which produced a quarter of the world's GDP, after 200 years of colonialism, we were producing less than 5%. I don't know how this happens, On one hand, you keep growing, but on the other hand, the economy keeps shrinking. But he went to the extent of arguing that the proverbial debt of the Indian peasantry was a sign of their prosperity, So I wondered, where did he get this from? This is the title of the governor of Punjab and later the finance secretary in India, in colonial India, Malcolm Darling. Punjab peasants in prosperity and debt. So they're in debt because, like the American peasant, they are borrowing to buy an aircraft, to spray their fields and so on and so forth. So it is like putting salt on the wounds of the Indian peasant who was dying virtually of starvation in the colonial period. I critique this kind of position, which has become fashionable. Tirthankar Roy is actually taught in Delhi University in many colleges. As I said, colonization of the mind is the most difficult thing to oppose, to break through from. Political imperialism is very easy. You see the foreigner out, they throw him out. The next more difficult thing is economic control, which is what Nehru was able to do. Get us out of a neo-colonial situation where we were economically dominated still by the country from which we became politically independent. But the freeing of the mind, the decolonization of the mind, is perhaps the most difficult thing. And that is a project that we must continuously keep fighting, otherwise we regress. I think Tirthankar Roy is an example of the regression from R.C. Dutt, or from Dadabhai Naoroji. In a century, you come right back to the circle that our professors can argue a position which will really embarrass even Lord Curzon. He would say, "Bhai, hum achhe to the, par itna acha nahi tha," as you are describing. Okay. In the second part of the book, I discuss how basic classes in India, the two basic classes, working class and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, how they approached the issue of nationalism and imperialism, and how they understood the relationship, very subtle relationship between class, party, and nation. And I believe that the understanding, a correct understanding of that, is what determined which class would exercise hegemony over Indian society, Indian movement, national movement, and consequently over the Indian state after independence. In a longish essay, I argue that the Indian capitalist class was indeed led by brilliant organic intellectuals. You may not like the fact that they are capitalists, but that is another matter. But they were very brilliant intellectuals of the class, and pushed the class in towards Indian nationalism, to remain within the nationalist framework rather than join the imperial and communal framework, on the one hand. And on the other hand, they understood subtly the difference between a movement which is multi-class and a class which is the dominant class. That is, they understood the relative autonomy of a movement from each class. The communist movement, on the other hand, periodically went completely sectarian. And this happened largely because of the position that was taken under Stalin's leadership on the 6th Congress of the Comintern in 1928. Mostly communists did not agree with that, but such was the prestige of the Soviet Union at that time that that position became popular. And the position is very simply this. They argued that the capitalists were comprador. They were agents of the British. They were not anti-imperialist. Number two, they argued that the Indian National Congress, that is the party of the national movement, was a capitalist party. That is, the capitalists controlled the Congress. They didn't see the relative autonomy of the Congress or the national movement from the party. And third, corollary of these two assumptions, capitalists are comprador, Congress is capitalist, therefore Congress is also comprador. So in 1930, when the civil disobedience movement was led, the slogan was that this is a sham movement. And the left within the Congress was described, people like Nehru and Bose, as more dangerous, even more dangerous, because they're pretending to be left, but they are basically imperialist agents. Now, this position did disaster to the left. So therefore, they shifted in the 7th Congress in 34. But they never questioned the basic understanding. So this sectarian position keeps reappearing, even in academia, even till today. I won't, if you have questions, I'll tell you who all does do it. But even today, we repeat the more or less the same understanding of the Congress being a bourgeois party and Gandhi being the bourgeois leader and what have you. All right. And the result of that was that the communist movement, which was led heroically and bravely by a large number of people, and it became the most powerful contender for hegemony by the 1930s over the national movement. Despite all that, they ended up not being, they were not able to empower the socialist vision sufficiently to hold sway over the national movement as well as the post-colonial Indian state. That brings me to the third part, which is the post-colonial Indian state, which reflected the nature of the Indian national movement. Now, this is a truism which is totally forgotten, that a state, as it is born, must necessarily carry the imprint of the movement which has created that state. If Pakistan is formed with a movement in the name of Islam and separatism, you cannot, when Pakistan is formed, declare, as Jinnah declared, that now that we are a free country, we will be a secular democratic country. He gave this famous speech, which poor Advani quoted and lost his job for it. But he did. He did give that speech. But he couldn't. You cannot ride a tiger and suddenly say, "Achha, main abhi thodi der ke liye utar raha hu." You can't, you know. You can't have a Bolshevik revolution and they say at the end we will have a bourgeois democratic society. You can't, right? So therefore, let us study the movement. That's why history is important. You cannot write economics of post-independent India if you haven't read history. You would be amazed that the best of the economists, have, because they've been told since childhood that you must have an introduction to your book. So they have an introduction where they will have one line or two lines, that there was a national planning committee before independence, but life began with the first plan. M. Khusro, the most well-known writer on land reforms in India, writes in his most quoted work that land reforms in India were successful because of a very committed bureaucracy in India after independence. 100 years of peasant movements before that is not even mentioned. This is what happens. This is why, any discipline, unless it is informed with history, you don't make breakthroughs. The greatest economists have written history. The greatest philosophers have written history. Marx wrote history. Boris Dobb wrote history. He's an economist. Wallerstein, a sociologist, wrote history. So it's very important that you must have a historical perspective. Now, what is this? What is the movement that we had, which created the new state? The movement had, in my opinion, 5 basic ideas, which created the imagination of the Indian nation, which Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. Now, the 5 basic ideas were anti-imperialism, that is, India will be a sovereign country. It will not become junior partner to this, that, and the other. It will be a democracy. It will be secular. And throughout the colonial period, these two words were conjoined. You talked of secular democracy. Because you cannot be secular if you're not democratic. And you cannot be a democracy if you are not secular. You cannot say I am a Democrat, but I am a Hindu Democrat. Musliman ko jai bhad mein, hai na? So it cannot be. It's just as the two phrases communalism and loyalism were used conjointly, secularism and democracy were used conjointly. Just as the threat to secularism in India is a direct attack on democracy. That will be the end of my discussion. The fourth idea was a pro-poor orientation. I choose my words carefully. I didn't say socialist, though the socialist and communist strand became more and more powerful, but it was not a consensus. But there was a consensus in the Indian national movement on the pro-poor. Dadabhai Naoroji's first book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Read R.C. Dutt, read Rana Day. They are focusing on the poor, right? Then, of course, Gandhi, turning the face towards the Daridra Narayan, and then the socialist, then Nehru, then communist. There is a consensus. Bhagat Singh, just name, everybody had the same view. Lastly, scientific temper. These were the 5 basic values on which there was a consensus in the national movement. It is not Nehru Gandhi. Every stream of the nationalists, from moderates to extremists to the Gandhians to the socialists to the revolutionaries, they agreed on these 5 ideas. They may have other differences, but they agreed on the 5. The only people who did not agree on any of the 5 were the communalists and the loyalists. So that's a thing you must remember. Now, another factor which is important about this idea of India was that the Indian national movement was a mass movement. And it was a prolonged mass movement, a 100-year-long mass movement. In other words, it was not a guerrilla-led movement which captured power. Not a group of professional revolutionaries capturing power or the Red Army. It was ordinary people over decades being involved in a movement. Millions of them. The greatest mass movement in world history. Millions upon millions, ordinary people got involved, which meant the ideas of this movement went deep down into the minds of the Indian people. Which meant that at independence, one could not say, okay, now that we are independent, let's have an authoritarian regime in cahoots with an industrial bourgeoisie and we'll quickly promote growth and talk about democracy later. Which model? South Korea. Nobody could argue that, okay, now that we are independent, let's hinge on to a superpower and quickly grow. And then later on, we'll try to get independence. Which country? Japan. So nobody in India could argue that. Neither the capitalists argued that, nor communists. Nobody argued that. Anybody who argued this would be in the dustbin of history. The only argument that was made, which was outside the idea of India, was that let's have a Hindu Rashtra. That idea, as I will discuss presently, was also squashed at the beginning itself, but I'll talk about it later. In this section, I talk about the gigantic effort made by Jawaharlal Nehru after independence to implement this idea of India. I'm taking 1 minute on this simply because if there is anybody who's been as malign as Jawaharlal Nehru, I would be shocked in India. Every possible thing that has gone wrong is put on Jawaharlal Nehru. Why are we poor? Jawaharlal Nehru. Why is there communalism? Jawaharlal Nehru. Why is there partition of India? Jawaharlal Nehru. And not me. This is your leader who tells you all this, right? So in this situation, let me just tell you that what Nehru undertook was a historically unique effort in world history, which is to make a transition from tradition into modernity, from lack of development into industrialism, with democracy and sovereignty. No country in the world did it. The transition to industrialism happened, just name the country, with slavery, with with 50% land tax, with colonialism. Each country which industrialized in the West had a colony, right? When Britain colonized, industrialized, the conditions were Dickensian. I mean, the question of democracy is not even there, right? So it was a unique effort, and Nehru himself was conscious of it. He says this is a path uncharted in history. I'm quoting him. So, and he made this amazing effort from, to use a term used by economists, from initial conditions, which, to use Rabindranath Tagore's phrase, which was the mud and filth left behind by the British. What was the mud and filth left behind? The average life expectancy in 1950, believe you me, was less than 30 years. On an average, people died in their late 20s, which means the poor must have died when they were in their tens or fives or three or two. So that is your initial condition. 92% of the women were illiterate in 1950, 84% of the Indian population. You had a shrinking agricultural output, shrinking. Your per capita income was declining annually for the last 30 years. So that is your initial condition. So when people now say कि 70 साल में कुछ नहीं हुआ, you are crazy. You do not realize where you started from and where you have reached. So I have a whole section on this, which I will not talk about. I will end with focusing on the most difficult challenge to the implementing of the idea of India, which is the communal challenge, which had to be handled at the time of independence itself. I focus on this because this ugly head has survived and has become the chief threat to India today. The longest lasting legacy of colonialism globally has not been that it devastated the economies of the colonies, or they did huge political and cultural damage. The longest lasting legacy, wherever colonialism went, they've left behind a divided people. From the first colony, Ireland, still divided on the issue of Protestants and Catholics. To any part of the world which had been colonized, you will find division is their chief issue, just as to us today, division has become the chief issue. Now, what happened at independence? Just 2 or 3 minutes on this. Just imagine the years 46 to 48, 2 years. It's similar to the Holocaust in Europe. Beginning with the Calcutta killings, then the Noakhali killings, then the killings in Bihar, killings in Punjab and Delhi, the partition of the country, 5 lakh people killed, at least 6 million people, refugees coming into India, people who were homeless, whose property had been snatched, whose families had been murdered. Now, in that situation of communal temperature, being at the peak, the father of the nation is murdered by a Hindu communalist. And Jawaharlal Nehru was very conscious. He wrote, he says, this is not the act of one madman. He says it is the product of an organization, and he didn't hide which that organization was. You don't have to think very hard to guess. He said it is the act of an organization which is trying to create a coup and capture power. That is, they are trying to change the nature of the state. The state that was born was a product of the national movement, which was a secular democratic state. They were trying to use this situation of communal tension, the riots, etc., to say India must be a Hindu Rashtra. It should be the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan. They've got Muslim Pakistan, we should have a Hindu Rashtra. And what did our nationalist leaders do at that time to face this situation, which is much worse than what we have today? So when people despair and say, how can we fight? Look at our situation, people are communalized, etc. Think of that situation and what did they do? I'll give you 2-3 minutes of what did they do. What did Gandhiji do? Gandhiji was in Noakhali, as you know, a remote part of what is now in Bangladesh, because that is where the riots were happening. And when was he there? He went there in November 1946. This is the time when the biggest event in 20th century world history is happening. That is transfer of power from Britain to India. It changed the whole picture of the world. After that, colonialism of that kind collapsed everywhere else. So it's a huge event. And the leader of that movement is sitting in Noakhali. So all the other leaders went up to Gandhiji and said, when will you come back? How long will you be there? He said, as long as it takes. And he was there for 4 months, till February 1947, walking the streets, the villages of Noakhali. And since he was in an hostile atmosphere. The Muslim League was in governance. They were throwing human excreta and broken glass on his path, and his response was to take off his sandals. The imagery was the crucifixion of the self. He was punishing himself, that what society have I created that my people are doing what they're doing, these heinous crimes that they're doing. All right. And what was Nehru doing? When the killings in Bihar, in response to the killings in Noakhali happened here in Bihar, large number of Muslims, particularly even in the rural areas, were being murdered. Nehru landed up in Bihar with his entire cabinet. Sardar Patel, Acharya Kripalani, C.R. Rajagopalachari, Maulana Azad, Anugrah Narayan Sinha, just name everybody. He said, all of you must land up in Bihar. We must ensure that these riots end now and now. And they were ended within a few days. Now, why am I telling you this? 40 miles from Delhi, a soldier's father is dragged out of his house after an announcement made from the temple saying that there is a suspicion that in his fridge the wrong kind of meat is there. He's dragged out and he's publicly lynched. Muzaffarnagar, another area where riots were engineered, has witnessed ethnic cleansing in India for the first time. People who were thrown out could not come back. Riot situations, normally, as you know, it happens, people run away, they come back. Nothing. It was ethnic cleansing. Not even helicopter visits by our leaders, So something obviously different has to be done. Learn from Gandhiji, as I said. He was there. He was there in Calcutta on 15th August 1947, on the day of independence, on the invitation of Suravardi, the Muslim League leader, because he thought that now that independence has come, the Muslims are going to be massacred. So Gandhiji agreed, provided Suravardi would stay in the same house, under the same roof with him. And they walked the streets together and not one person was killed. That's when Mountbatten said that Mahatma Gandhi, is a one-man boundary force. He says, Mountbatten writes that with all my soldiers and, regiments, we could not achieve in Punjab what Gandhiji alone did in Bengal. His last fast, just weeks before he was murdered, was on this question, that every Muslim who has been thrown out of his house in Delhi must be brought back. There were lakhs of them in refugee camps. Many of them ran away to Pakistan. They must be brought back. Their mosques must be repaired, which were being beaten. He was not afraid of the Muslim word. Which political party even mentions the word Muslim? The closest they come to saying is secular, or we are against anti-minority. But I'm saying that there's fear. But here are people who took it on, bang on. Lastly, what did Nehru do? He turned the first general election, 1951-52, into a referendum. No election in India since then, including the current one, is fought on this basic issue that will India be the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan, or will it be a secular India? And believe you me, 94% of the Indian people voted for a secular India. Nehru alone traveled 40,000 kilometers. 40,000 kilometers. He spoke to 35 million people directly, one-to-one. That is 1 out of 10 people in India at that time, as I am speaking to you. And he had no 8,000 crore aircraft to carry him from one place to the other. And the result, as I said, was therefore only 6%. Hindu Mahasabha and Hindu Rajya Parishad, etc., put together could get only 10 seats and 6% of the votes. In other words, communalism had been pushed back, but unfortunately not extinguished. And we are witnessing the result of that. This non-action against communalism, or lukewarm action against communalism, I'm so glad that in Guwahati that would not be the right description. Here people are fighting, but in large part of the country, certainly the mainstream hasn't caught on yet to the grave danger, is a surprise given the nature of the current situation, on which I would like to speak a little bit. The current situation is that the BJP has realized that they have seized governmental power, not on the states, not only in the states, but in the center. They have absolute majority. Absolute majority in the center. The government is in power of a regime which believes in Hindu Rashtra. But India is still not a Hindu state. That's their worry. So, how to convert the state into a theocratic, a Hindu state? Not just government power is not enough. For that, you have to convert the state apparatuses, change the state apparatuses, and civil society. And that is the task they've taken on. The judiciary, the media, the education system, these are state apparatuses, right? The bureaucracy, all of them have to be communalized. And most importantly, civil society has to be communalized. And in order to do that, you have to stop people, anti-nationals like us, from speaking. That our leadership actually read this textbook, and are following this path almost one by one. Now, here is what he says. The first thing that a fascist regime does, that it creates an idyllic, mythic past. The golden age. We were once very great. The German pride, etc. And this great past is now threatened by some outsider, some minority, some Jew is threatening this great past, the golden past, where the Hindu period, when we knew from science, technology, everything, philosophy, we were the greatest in the world, Vishwaguru, etc. Caste did not exist. Caste came only with the Muslims, as you know. These are textbooks being taught now. And the Mughal period, of course, you've been told, was a disaster, and so on and so forth. So you have to, therefore, rewrite history. In order to create this mythic past, you have to rewrite history. See what is happening in Russia. See what is happening in Turkey. Complete whitewash of their history. You have to now write a completely different history. If, in order to make people anti-Muslim, you have to demonstrate that, as they do in RSS textbooks, on which we have written a whole book, that what they have done in the past, what heinous crimes that they have done in the past, right? So that is number one. Number two, setting up an elaborate propaganda machinery. I won't waste time on this. You are aware, from WhatsApp to shakhas to bought-up newspapers to frightened journalists, complete capture of the media, almost complete. Honorable exceptions are sitting here. I can see Mr. Malakar sitting here doing the opposite, but that is not what is happening by and large. Third, using the propaganda machinery to create this is very important, create a sense of victimhood in the dominant majority. The dominant majority suddenly has to feel like the victim. The entire German race is threatened by the Jews, tiny little minority, right? Here we are threatened by the Muslims. Why? The rapidly multiplying Muslims, along with the Muslim infiltrators, the Ghuspetias, will, like termites, take over this country. The Hindus are being frightened. Not by RSS books. This is your Prime Minister's speech on 22nd April. He used these stereotypes as a dog whistle. He talked about जिनके बच्चे ज्यादा होते हैं, right? And he talked about the Ghuspetia, right? Fourth, the creation of sexual anxiety. The minority has some great sexual prowess. The Muslims are sexual beasts. Be aware. They will steal these, dainty little Hindu women through love jihad. Buddhu bana denge unko. Apart from everything else, it's an attack on Indian women. They can be all sort of carried away by these handsome Khans, So, but they take it seriously. So much so that there are laws in BJP states against so-called love jihad. Fifth, the equating of the majority with the nation and the minority as anti-national. This is in the RSS lexicon, the Muslims and Christians have been defined out of the nation altogether. They cannot be part of the nation. How? Their Guru Savarkar, who, as you know, had a very clear hand in the murder of the Mahatma, created the definition that anybody whose Pitri Bhumi and Punya Bhumi is not in the same country cannot be a national of that country. Now, a Muslim, his Punya Bhumi is not in India, it is in Makkah. So he cannot be an Indian. So only those religions in which have originated in India, the Hindus, the Sikhs, and the Buddhists, can be Indian. Christians and Muslims are defined out of India. But look how absurd this argument is, and how all the Hindus migrating to the USA do not notice this. By this definition, every Christian in Europe, every Christian in America, every Christian in South Korea cannot be a member of that country because their Punya Bhumi is in Jerusalem, But you won't apply it there. You apply it here. Muslims and Christians cannot be Indians, right? So minority is by definition anti-national. The equating of the government with the nation, and the corollary, the leader, quote unquote leader of the government, is equal to the nation. This is straight out of Mussolini's book. And as you know, the Hindutva leaders actually visited Italy, met Mussolini, imitated the techniques that they borrowed, wrote about it. There is a whole book on this by this Italian scholar, which has demonstrated the direct link with the fascists that the Hindu communalists had. Okay, so anybody who critiques the leader or the government becomes anti-national. They become Deshdrohi, Tukde Tukde gang, Lutyens Delhi, Khan Market gang, etc., etc. Whereas it is the duty of a citizen in a democracy to critique the government. It's a fundamental duty. But if you critique the government, you become anti-national. And this urban Naxal, Lutyens Delhi, Khan Market is also to discredit the intelligentsia, which brings me to the seventh aspect. Target the intelligentsia. Target front-ranking universities. This is what Hitler did to Frankfurt University. Decimated it. It's been written about by this famous management guru, Peter Drucker, who had to flee Frankfurt to the United States and wrote about what was done to that university. It is as if when they attacked JNU, they were borrowing from what Hitler did to Frankfurt. Our students, directly my students were arrested. Some of them are still in jail simply because their name is Muslim. Umar Khalid and Anirban Bandyopadhyay, colleagues, worked together, same organization, same meeting, same crime, both put in jail. Anirban released. Umar Khalid, 3 years gone, is still in jail. And they haven't, his bail plea gets postponed, I think more than a dozen times. He cannot even make a bail plea. So you target students, you harass faculty, hound them, and you vilify the university in such a manner. Some of you who are JNUites will remember this, that in 2016, when this vilification and attack started, such was the word spread that taxis would refuse to bring students to JNU saying we don't go to Pakistan. So you can actually destroy, because people in JNU were taught to ask questions. So this constant vilification of the intelligentsia, targeting them, selectively picking them up, however Gandhian they may be, whether it is Harsh Mandar or Sudha Bhardwaj, put them in jail. And as I said, even if they do not listen after that, then shoot them. The US State Department reported in 2021 to the Congress, I'm quoting, attacks on members of religious minority communities, including killings, assault, and intimidations, occurred throughout the year. So this is not just me. I mean, the whole world knows what is going on. Let me quote this. The Economist. The Economist says the following. Hindu nationalists, again, this is an oxymoron. This was never used in the freedom struggle days. How can you be Hindu nationalist? It's a contradiction in terms. In a multi-religious society, if you say you're a Hindu nationalist, you are anti-national. As Nehru repeatedly said, they are not nationalists, they are anti-national. They break the country, right? But anyway, because some Angrez, in this case Christopher Jeffrelot, not Angrez but Frenchman, who's a very good scholar, but popularized this phrase Hindu nationalist. So dutifully, all of us, particularly our journalists, have picked up this and now talk of the BJP as Hindu nationalists. And they're delighted that the word nationalist has got attached to them finally, and not loyalist or communalist or tukre tukre, So it says the Hindu nationalist speakers at public rallies across northern India in recent years have launched bidding wars of threats against Muslims, from mass rape to mass expulsion. On 7th May, Hari Bhushan, it sounds very close to the other Bhushan, Brij Bhushan, a BJP politician in Bihar, in eastern India, declared that Muslims should be burnt alive, just like effigies of the Hindu demon Ravan. Hindu religious leaders linked with Hindutva movement without any fear of state intervention have repeatedly have been talking of arming the Hindus and committing genocide of the Muslims. I have personally heard them in front of police stations making these announcements. Arm yourselves. Don't waste money on useless things, buying computers. Buy arms. We have to exterminate the Muslims. Then the article goes on to say, Kapil Mishra, a local BJP leader, spun the events that happened following a provocative Hindu procession. The Ram Navami procession has to go in front of the masjid. There is no other route, And over there only they have to sing songs and abuse, etc. So there was a fracas. So what they did was Kapil Mishra spun this and he said they should be identified and their homes should be bulldozed. A few hours later, bulldozers duly rolled in, smashing Muslim property for alleged building violation codes in Delhi. Just a few weeks ago, a 13th century mosque in Delhi was demolished, saying that it violates building violations. Building violation which has come 700 years after the mosque is made. So it is amazing. The bulldozer has become the frightening imagery as well as the reality of punishing the minorities. They flaunt it. Adityanath, I'm sorry, he shares my first half of the name. Actually said, he talks about his being, using the bulldozer. I'm the bulldozer chief minister. And other chief ministers say, I'm also bulldozer chief minister. In August 2023, as recent as that, following again a deliberately provoked conflict in Mewat. Mewat is a Muslim-dominated region just outside Delhi. The Punjab and Haryana High Court was constrained to take suo motu action, intervening against the targeted bulldozing of the properties of the Muslims once this fracas emerged. And what did the Haryana and Punjab High Court order said? It said they're questioning whether the buildings belonging to a particular community are being brought down under the guise of law and order problem, and an exercise of ethnic cleansing is being conducted by the state. It's not a small thing. A High Court judgment saying that ethnic cleansing is being conducted by the state. Of course, within days they were transferred, but they had grown a spine. They spoke up and said, this is ethnic cleansing, called a spade a spade. No wonder India is no longer described as a democracy outside India. We of course say we are the mother of democracy. Mother or father, I don't know, but the world doesn't think of us as a democracy. The VDEM Institute of Sweden, the US-based Freedom House, or the Economist's Economic Intelligence Unit, which produces a democracy index, they talk of India as a democratic backsliding. They call it a partially free democracy, a flawed democracy, and now the VDEM has dropped the word democracy itself. They call India an electoral autocracy. We are not even described as a democracy, and we are just one step away, which is the last stage, which is the closed autocracy. All right? We are 104 in the democracy index, but don't worry, because our leader says we must be on the top. We are on the top. We are among the top 10 autocrisers of the world. That is one of the top 10 societies which are moving towards autocracy. This is what the Guardian quotes Jason Stanley. This is the last quotation I will use. He says, the hallmarks of fascism are everywhere in India. School texts are being rewritten to reinforce the fake history behind BJP's Hindu nationalist agenda. Topics like the theory of evolution and the periodic table have been replaced with traditional Hindu theories. You may be wondering that why do they want to mess with Darwin? Theory of evolution. Arey bhai, if you have theory of evolution, then how can rishis be born in matkas? And this is not only India. This happened in the United States also. In the 19th century, unfortunately, not now, that they were against theory of evolution being taught because they said otherwise what will happen to the Immaculate Conception. Then it goes on. There are clear indications of India's slide towards fascism. On press freedom, India's rank is 161 out of 180. We are sandwiched between Venezuela and Russia. So our press freedom is close to what it is in, or press unfreedom is close to what it is in Russia. India's minorities face lynchings and bulldozing of their homes. 10% of the world's Muslim population live in India. 200 million plus live in India. And as Gregory Stanton, you must have heard of him, he was the founder director of the Genocide Watch, the organization which predicted the genocide in Rwanda. And what he has to say is the following. He says he's warned in a public talk at the US congressional briefing. He said, we are seeing in India the beginning of what would be the largest genocide in history. So it is not a joking matter. We are being pushed towards a civil war kind of situation. 200 million people are not going to sink into the sea or migrate to Pakistan. If you go on provoking, then you will land up in a situation of permanent civil war. I've taken far too much time, but give me 5 minutes more. I'll skip what has happened to India in the poverty, pro-poor issue, except to just quote you one figure. We keep talking of, flaunting, we have so many billionaires. We sort of brag about our billionaires in a situation where half our children suffer from malnutrition. Nearly half suffer from malnutrition. In a situation where we are rapidly falling in the development index, and believe you me, we are shamefully ranked 111 out of 125 countries in the global hunger index. We are below sub-Saharan Africa in the hunger index. And this much flaunted mother of democracy is far below in hunger index the other South Asian countries. Sri Lanka at 60, we are at 111. Nepal at 69, we are at 111. And believe you me, Muslim-dominated Bangladesh is also at 81, whereas we are at 111. So much for your back thumping. Lastly, the issue of the scientific temper, a phrase which Nehru had coined in the discovery of India and which actually is enshrined in our constitution in Article 51A. We are supposed to be promoting scientific temper. And what do? I'll just quote this. It is well known, but it's worth reminding ourselves what is happening to us and not get used to it. I'm quoting again the Guardian. The Guardian is quoting our Prime Minister. Our Prime Minister says, we can feel proud of what our country achieved in medical science at one point of time. He told a gathering of doctors and other professionals while inaugurating a hospital in Mumbai. We all read about Karna in Mahabharata. If we think a little more, he's encouraging the people to think, we realize that Mahabharata says Karna was not born in his mother's womb. This means that genetic science was present at that time. He thought very hard, you see. So he's come to the conclusion genetic science was known. That is why Karna would be born outside his mother's womb. We worship Lord Ganesha. This you've heard many times. There must have been some plastic surgeon at that time who got an elephant head on the body of a human being and began the uh, practice of plastic surgery. Not only is this outrageous, but the dignitaries who were in the audience, you would recognize them by face. Some of the top surgeons of the country's top industrialists, top actors, the tall ones also, sitting there, and not one walked out, leave alone protest. The intelligentsia once again needs to grow a spine. That is what won our independence. And if we want to win independence from this, our intelligentsia needs to grow a spine. The Hindustan Times, I would also like to quote, not my favorite newspaper. Hindustan Times were forced to uh, report that the governor of Bengal, while addressing a science and engineering fair in Kolkata, said that the mythological character Arjun had arrows which were nuclear tipped. तो उसके सामने एटम बम लगा हुआ था, है ना? So, and you would think that people will laugh as you laughed and that something will happen. He gets promoted. He is now the vice president of the country. No wonder Corona is fought in this country with state patronage, with Gobar, Gomutra, Ganga Snan, Tali, Thali banging, shining mobile torches at the coronavirus and saying, Corona, go, Corona, go. This is not me, this is your Prime Minister. In sum, it is as if the political leaders have reversed their roles from that of pulling up society and bringing it in line with the highest global civilizational values, a role performed by our national movement leaders, people like Gandhi, Nehru, and so many others, to that of pushing society back by appealing to sectarian identities, the acquisitive instincts, and traditional prejudices. The hegemonic idea of India, the common sense of the Indian people created by the Indian national movement, is today severely challenged. And that challenge is important, is not coming from the backward and traditional people of India. That challenge is coming from the state and its leadership. The fantastic efforts to raise India from what Tagore called the mud and filth left behind by the British has now been replaced with the Indian people being pushed back into the same mud and filth of ignorance, obscurantism, disempowerment, unfreedom, and above all, communal hatred. I don't want to end in such a pessimistic note. All is not lost. There is hope. The most important legacy of our national movement was that it showed the capacity of the Indian people to resist. And this is accepted globally. When Cardoso, the Brazilian president, visited India in the late 90s, he's the one who brought Brazil into post-military rule, democratic rule, said that your advantage over Brazil is that your people will resist oppression, will resist takeover by superpowers, etc., etc. You have the tradition of Gandhi, and then he said Gandhi, the communists, the socialists, etc., etc. So our people, against all odds, resisted during the, for example, as you are aware, the CAA movement, led by women and the youth in Delhi. It was old women, who were leading it. And significantly, they were carrying the Constitution of India, photos of Gandhi, of Bhagat Singh, of Ambedkar in their hands while fighting this oppressive regime. Our peasants have shown their enormous capacity to resist. This was the big discovery of our Indian national movement, that which Gandhiji made, that how you can make the poor peasants, ordinary peasants resist, and resist valiantly and for long periods of time. And that was witnessed outside the Delhi borders when the black laws were brought in and peasants from Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh tried to come to Delhi. They were blocked. There were thorns put on the road, and they sat through the more than 45 degrees temperature of summer of Delhi. They sat through the winter of Delhi, the monsoons. They sat there till the laws were withdrawn and the leader publicly had to apologize. So there is There is hope. Our civil society groups, hounded by the government, squeezed out of all funding, etc., arrested, their leaders arrested, have stood up. When the Prime Minister made this notorious speech about Jada Bacche Wale and Kushpetia, within 4 hours, 14,000 people in writing protested to the Election Commission of India. I mean, that says something. You know, they are aware that their names will be watched, because when you sign up for this, your email has to be given. You know, so it's not that you just go and put a squiggle and say, "Ki maine sign kar diya." You know, you're identifying yourself. So these are these small acts of courage, standing up to your parents or to the neighbor or to whoever, you know, who's spitting venom, is matter of some courage. Lastly, our political leaders have also taken courage in their hands after a long time. They've hit the streets. They're doing these long yatras in the face of repression and the knowledge that you can be bumped off. Most important, our political leaders have finally learned the most important lesson from the history of fascism, that in order to fight fascism, you have to unite all forces which are opposed to fascism. It is not a fight between the left and the right. It is not a fight between various shades of the left, as the left movement in Germany realized. You have to join hands with everybody. It is a fight between the highest civilizational values of the world, which we have learned to respect, and savagery and barbarism. I'm sure the genius of the Indian people will overcome this challenge too. Thank you for your patience.